Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today from Providence, Rhode Island is Theodore Bogosian, Ted Bogosian, who is a filmmaker and also now a professor both at Brown University and at Duke University in the United States. Ted, thank you for giving us the time.
My pleasure, Selfie.
Ted, you, 25 years ago, broke new ground. You made a film called An Armenian Journey, and you took Mariam Davis to Mardin, where she was born, Mardin in southeastern Turkey. Now, I'm not sure our listeners remember who Mariam Davis is or know where Mardin is, so let's start at the top. Tell us about Mariam Davis.
Mariam Davis was the most remarkable woman I've ever met. She was born in 1910, and in 1915, when she was 5 years old, her family suffered atrocities during the genocide in eastern Turkey, and she managed to survive and lived there for another 5 years when she was adopted by a missionary and raised in New York City in cafe society in the 1920s, and married a famous photographer, moved to New Mexico, and I met her in the mid-'80s after she did with the Zorian Institute an oral history. She was the first survivor video I looked at, and it turned out that she was the woman who I decided to bring back to eastern Turkey, to the place where the atrocities occurred.
Was it
because
hard
I
to
felt
convince her?
she stood the best chance of presenting the ring of truth of her survivor's story to the world.
You talk a lot about truth and the role of truth in motivating you to do what you do.
It's true. And in this particular case, when I decided to tell this story and bring for the first time to American broadcast television the documentary about the Armenian Genocide, I knew that there would be a lot of resistance upon broadcast. So my journalism had to be bulletproof, and that meant that I not only had to be truthful in the journalistic sense, but I had to be truthful in the emotional sense, because I think there's a lot of persuading that needs to be done. There's a lot of introductory information that needs to be presented, and then also for people who deny the genocide, there's some persuasion involved. So the reason I chose Mariam in part is because she speaks unaccented American English. And that's because she was raised in New York, came to the United States at a very early age. And when she presented her story, it wasn't like other survivors' stories, which are told in Armenian or are in heavily accented English. She presented emotional truth as well as journalistic truth on her way through the village. It's impossible to deny her story, I think, if one sees her in her village for the first time in 70 years, as we do in the film, walking through the streets, knowing the locations, having recollections that only someone who was there at that time could have.
You went to Mardin 25 years ago at a time when access to Turkey, to the eastern parts, especially for Armenians, really wasn't that easy. What did you do? What were the obstacles that you didn't expect, perhaps?
Well, we went as tourists. So when I invited Mariam to come along, she asked her daughter to come along also as her escort, and I brought one other filmmaker with me. So we went into the interior from Istanbul. We filmed sort of surreptitiously for a day. Then we flew to Ankara, changed planes, went to Elazig, and ultimately reached the destination. And we didn't know how much trouble we were in. We tried to use small format 8mm gear and sound gear to record our documentary. At any time, I felt that had we been discovered for violating Article 301, we would have been jailed. There was that pressure, and I felt it bringing people to that situation. But the other three people, two Davises and Rob Moss, had American passports and surnames, and I felt that for that reason we were probably overlooked. And one amazing story, though, is it's slightly off topic, but I'll mention it. You know, we did our filming, we came back, and it turned out that all of our film somehow was lost by what was then TWA Airlines somewhere between Istanbul, where we packed our bags, and New York. So we went from Istanbul to Frankfurt to New York, and when we got off the plane in New York, there was no film in our luggage. Those bags were missing. And naturally, we panicked for several days until TWA located the suitcase that had somehow arrived in London. And I always thought that someone was watching us, and somehow they knew that they weren't going to let this film get out of the country. But I think, in fact, it was just an airline mistake, and the rest is history.
Our guys here are sitting, shaking their heads. Next time they'll come with you and carry them, okay?
Well, I don't know what possessed me to leave the cartridges of 8mm film in our luggage, but I think it was probably that had we been searched on our way out of the country, I wanted to stand the best chance of having the film make it if we didn't. So who knows, but it all turned out well.
Ted, tell us about the actual process of filming this emotional experience. For you, it was the first time. For her, it was, well, not the first time, but certainly a very difficult return. Was it better for that reason, or was it harder?
Well, it was extremely difficult to be there for me. I went looking for in Harpert for my family's dwelling and couldn't find it. And I think the most gut-wrenching moment came after Mariam left the flowers in the water to commemorate her family's death there. It turned out that Mariam had never told her daughter the story of her life.
Wow.
It's still very emotional to me. And that was the moment when Mariam's daughter, Joan, figured out why her mother behaved in certain ways throughout her lifetime. So after that day, they went back to the hotel and had a long conversation which shall remain private. It was a very loud and emotional conversation. And then Mariam sat next to me on the airplane and cried.
I can only imagine.
For 18 hours. She cried all the way from Istanbul to New York.
I can only imagine. I remember those survivor interviews, and it's always amazing the number of people whose children had not heard the story.
So you can imagine having a parent, and that parent has experiences which are obviously dominating their interior life, and they don't share them with their children. And so that's one more example, one more small but very important example of how the genocide and its denial is affecting people through the generations today and will continue in the future. And that's why I made the film, and that's why I want to make another film, because I feel that the genocide continues as long as the denial persists.
Thank you for very eloquently putting that message out, because really 100 years later, that is now the issue, isn't it?
It is the issue. And I think we've seen more genocides more frequently. When the film was made and broadcast in the late 1980s, we didn't know there would be a Serbia. We didn't know there would be
a Rwanda.
We didn't know there would be a Central African Republic. And I think what's happening right now in the world is that there is a genocide ongoing in Africa that is barely covered. The worldwide media is well aware of it. It is remote, but with the means we have available, it could be covered on a daily basis. Part of the denial of the Armenian genocide is that the Turks say there was no coverage. People who deny it say there was no coverage or insufficient coverage of the genocide. And I think what we're finding now is that genocides can occur with insufficient coverage. And because there is one happening, and there have been genocides happening in recent years, right under our eyes and right under our noses. So history, in a way, is overtaking the denial slowly, because other ethnic groups who are suffering are beginning to understand how there's a pattern that started with the Armenian genocide, and they're taking more of an interest in it. And the Wolfgang Gust book, which presents the translations into English of all the German cables and implicates the German government. And military.
Also published by the Zorian Institute.
Exactly right. And my point is that, you know, what we're seeing now is that the pattern which began 100 years ago is being followed, and it's in part because of the denial of what happened to Armenians.
Thank you. Ted Bogosian, filmmaker in Providence, Rhode Island. Ted Bogosian's film, An Armenian Journey, 25 years ago, was the first on American broadcast television, public television. And we look forward to speaking with Ted in the future about new projects. Thank you, Ted.
You're welcome, Salpi. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and thank you for following us on CivilNet.